No lab today because this is the week we were going to be doing the lab quiz, and frankly, I vegged, didn't keep track of things because we got busy with exams and all such other crap, and I didn't really give everybody a heads up warning long enough for me to feel comfortable doing this to you. So next week, we're going to have a lab quiz. At this point, it's fairly easy. Looking at stains, can you recognize it as gram-positive, gram-negative? What do the different tests mean in terms of like lipase? What is a Durham tube doing if you got gas, and the phenol solutions where they went from red to yellow? They're acid producers and they produce gas. Some basic stuff like that. So just all the different metabolic tests. I'll give you a little bit of a reviewy thing or heads up with that this week. Let's see. Second, I've been recording lectures, but I've been lame about posting them. Sorry. I'm going to get all the PowerPoints up to you as well. Third, looking at the syllabus, and I think we are due for another test, and we're probably going to do it the exact same way we did the first one, which is I'm going to drop it on Friday, it'll be due on Monday. And so same format, same thing. I will put together, again, sort of a list of like lecture note review things for the different chapters. We're going to be covering, I think, up through the respiratory tract, but I'll let you know. Okay. So, yeah, that's pretty much all I got to say.
So up to the stuff that we're doing right now?
No, this is gastrointestinal.
Oh, okay.
So it would be the previous chapters. Yeah.
All right.
All right. So we finished up, and there's some interesting little stories in the book as well about some of these things. This is, of course, one of the bacterial diseases that can happen with meat that's not being prepared as carefully as it should be. E. coli is probably present on meat a lot, but only occasionally do you have a strain, 0157, that actually has a virus integrated into its genome that produces a whole range of different toxins, and it has a transposon, it should be a plasmid, an extra chromosomal piece of DNA that produces lipopolysaccharide, LPS, which is a really potent toxin. And so E. coli is present, but this strain of it can make you really, really sick. And this is a little interesting point. Over the years in the biochemistry of food class, we've done the experiment where we are looking at bacteria loads on different foods. And so I'll go down to the Kroger and get like a packaged potato salad and chicken, which is always one of my favorites to play with. And then I used to do ground beef. And now I've been doing this for a while. Probably back the turn of the current century, you might see a bacterium or two in a package of ground beef. These days, I don't even bother with it. I have not seen a single colony in ground beef in years. Ground beef is sterile. I mean, I think that during the processing of it, they're fogging it with ammonia or different kinds of gaseous disinfectants, such that pretty much the ground beef you get at least the packaged stuff, it is sterile, which is nice. It's a good thing. If you were to grind your own beef, you probably would have all kinds of different bacteria in it, but that would be from the surface of the tools, the instruments you use, and the grinder and stuff. The real problem comes with coli and the fact that during the butchering process, not to be too graphic, but you can puncture the intestines and get a little bit of cow poop on your meat. No, let's not do that. So, for the most part, though, this is not a significant issue. Now, another very interesting little bacterium that you perhaps have heard of is the bacterium Helicobacter pylori. And it is a discovered bacterium, was not known, that is actually causing ulcers. And so for the longest time, up until like the 80s, ulcers were thought to be caused by excessive stress and producing excessive acid, and people would treat ulcers by drinking milk and taking antacids. And I'm not sure exactly of the entire story, but a researcher began to suspect that this was the bacterium that caused it. And he actually took a flask of Helicobacter pylori and drank it. And within a week, he began to have a gastric ulcer. And what this means is you don't treat gastric ulcers by reducing the amount of acid in the stomach. You treat them with antibiotics. And it has been a fairly major change in the way we treat gastric ulcers. And so, this thing is shaking. Stop. It made me dizzy. So you have a gastric ulcer, you can have a duodenal ulcer, depending on where you are in the digestive tract. So here it is actually adhered to the stomach mucosa. It binds, and one of the things it does is it releases urease, which is able to take urea and break it down to generate ammonia. And this is in part giving it a little pH neutralizing space around where it's landed. And so even though it's being exposed to the stomach juices, it builds a little nest of relatively stable pH. And it then begins to actually invade and digest the mucosal layer surrounding the epithelial cells of your stomach. And the stomach itself is covered in kind of a slime coating that prevents it from essentially digesting itself. You begin to pull that apart or disrupt that, and you start to have inflammation. The gastric acids begin to affect this, and you start to bore a hole into your stomach. And so it's a novel mechanism by which we have bacteria interacting with us. And this ability to neutralize the gastric acid is a fairly clever trick. Yes?
So I heard a story about someone taking Tums, which led to a gastric ulcer, stomach ulcer. Can Tums lead to that?
No. See, the Tums are a standard kind of calcium-based antacid. And the idea would be you are reducing the amount of acid in your stomach. Because acid reflux and acid indigestion occur when you have excessive acid in the stomach, which can be because of stress or different drugs as well. That would not lead necessarily to the colonization by this bacteria. I would think there would be two separate things. Okay. Think about that. One thing is you take Tums and you reduce the acid for a time, but you don't reduce it by that much, and your stomach doesn't work at neutral pH. So people will take these things thinking they're doing some good, but they probably aren't doing much, or it's very temporary. There are things like esophageal reflux and acid reflux, and there are whole sets of drugs that actually biochemically block the proton pumps, the hydrogen pumps, that are pumping the hydrogen ion out, which changes the pH, and that is how you really begin to, long-term change the pH of the stomach. Otherwise, it's a real temporary thing, and it's like lots of things you think it might be working, but probably not doing much. Like on the box of baking soda, and you can get baking soda that you would use for deodorizing your refrigerator. Baking soda, of course, is used in cooking a lot, baking. Depending on the box and where you get it, it can actually have a U.S. Pharmacopoeia listing on it, talking about its use as an antacid, and they very much caution you shouldn't have baking soda on an overly full stomach because the baking soda specifically interacts with the acid and generates carbon dioxide gas, and you could have, shall we say, a large belch, blah, which would be unpleasant. So you take this, but fairly quickly you're going to recover the pH balance, low pH in the stomach. Oh, let's see, another bacterium that's found in a variety of different kinds of foods, Campylobacteria, which causes pretty serious diarrhea, bloody stools. It invades the intestinal lining. It's pretty severe, but generally not fatal. Diarrhea for 5 to 7 days. Oh boy, count me in. Fairly common as well, and it comes up and then goes away. It is actually found in a variety of different kinds of foods. Animals, poultry often have it. It can end up in milk through less than hygienic practices. One more reason why drinking raw milk is probably not the smartest thing you could do for yourself. So again, this is invading in the mucosal lining of the intestine, and it's blocking the ability of the large intestine to pull water out. That's pretty much how you generate diarrhea. All right, another intestinal bacteria, Listeria monocytogenes. Listeria is a pretty nasty guy. It's what's known as a facultative anaerobe, in that it is able to operate in the intestine and in parts of the intestine that don't have a lot of oxygen, and pretty much your large intestine, at least the upper part, is anaerobic, part of the digestion process. In susceptible populations, that can be fairly serious. It is one of these bacteria that is psychotropic, or psychotrophic rather. It can grow in the refrigerator. It's able to actually operate in fairly cold environments. We typically have it on ourselves, or at least 10% of the population does. Initially, it's not too serious. Over time, the bacterium actually can invade into a cell and get sort of packaged up within the cell and then make its way out and begin punching holes through the cell membranes. And so it actually is quite invasive and actually is tearing cells up. One of the things this means is that once it burrows through the intestinal epithelium, it can actually then get into the systemic body system. You can have bacteria now in the blood, causing sepsis, which is darn lethal. Getting up in the brain, again, not a good place. Even making its way into the placenta and the fetal placental barrier, make its way through and cause spontaneous abortions. So this is a fairly nasty bacterium, given that it can actually burrow into a cell. So another common disease known as brucellosis is something found again in raw milk. And I guess like in Wisconsin, there's a new sort of push for drinking raw milk as if it has health benefits. And it's not a particularly well-founded idea, and you do have the risk of a variety of different nasty bacterial diseases. So, gram-negative is a coccobacillus in that it forms these little balls. It is also able to live within a cell, intracellular, and I guess in between cells as well. All right, so we've got a variety of different kinds of animals that can harbor them. You can end up with chronic infections, and you have then the sort of malaise, fever, muscle joint pain, things like that. Occasionally, it can begin to actually get into the brain and heart. If that happens, it is it is moderately lethal. So primarily, it is generated by the inappropriate interactions between agricultural animals and people, usually being transmitted by contact with farm animals, but you can also have it in the milk as well. So this is one, if you work in the hospital, you may have heard of, Clostridium difficile. Clostridium difficile is a gram-positive. As an obligate anaerobe, it actually only operates in the intestinal system, and it causes very severe very severe diarrhea. It's often associated with antibiotic use because as you take antibiotics, this bacterium can be present and not being maintained, kind of being kept at a low concentration. The antibiotics that aren't affecting this allow for the bacteria to start to grow up and now actually have a higher population. And it causes very severe diarrhea. In the hospital, this is a real serious problem in that it is fairly easily spread. You have equipment that can touch it, hands, staff, patients, visitors. You have spores that can germinate and then be ingested, and you can have asymptomatic carriers. Antibiotics are going to be affecting the normal gut bacteria and reducing their number, which is why you're encouraged to eat yogurt. And that can allow Clostridium to take its foothold. It begins to multiply, it begins releasing toxins, and it starts the whole cycle over again. So we got a couple of places where the cycle can be broken. Scrupulous cleaning of the environment and equipment, and the appropriate kinds of antibiotics and things. You can actually administer antibiotics rectally. And one of the things that is a oddball solution, but actually has some potential, is fecal transplants, which the even thought of it makes me a little uncomfortable. But they do it. So you too could become a fecal donor. I don't know how, but and you actually take a gastrointestinal tube, and because if you're thinking about this, you ain't going to start from the back end. You got to start from the front end. You place this tube way down into the duodenum, into the small intestine, and pump it in. And you're repopulating with a different group of microflora, bacteria, gut bacteria, and doing things. And bacteria in the gut are probably responsible for a whole range of different things. You can see the different kinds of infection, inflammation that can be produced. And so this can end up being a pretty serious problem. And it can be very difficult to treat. There was a time, about 5 years ago, was it? Yeah, 4 years ago. St. Mary's had an outbreak of Clostridium difficile, and they had a lot of people coming in. I think the usual rule was if you got C. diff while you're in the hospital, they comped your visit. They gave it to you free. Oh, thanks. All right. Just because we're going to stop here, and I'm going to go upstairs and put together the notes for the test and things like that, and we'll get ready for that. All right. 18 minutes and 46 seconds. Bye.